Thanks for clicking. My name is Mark Mitchell. I'm a mortgage broker here in London, Ontario. We had some big developments this week in China's real estate crisis as demonstrators took to the streets to protest Evergrande's inability to deliver on its housing promises. We also had a number of developments showing troubling signs in the Chinese economy as more and more warnings are coming out about potential stagflation, and we also saw Beijing continuing to bring down the hammer on real estate developers. So what I want to do today is start by going over the developments with Evergrande.
The president said spend. I spent.
Move on to some of the growing risks to the Chinese economy, which by their nature will have a big impact on the economies of both the United States and Canada and the West. And then finally, I want to check in on China's real estate developers as they are definitely starting to feel increased pressure from Beijing. We had some big news out this week on Canada's real estate market and some more news on the state of our debt levels, which I do want to have some updates on that next week. And of course, we'll continue to have our China updates every week on Friday. Click like and subscribe to get those updates, but for now, let's get into Evergrande. Well, the resumption of cash flow through a number of sales and a $1 billion cash injection from its founder may have led many to believe that the Evergrande crisis was over and that everything was fine. This is not actually the case.
At a time, especially for Evergrande, that is trying to meet its obligations and stay afloat at a time, of course, when its share price has sunk more than 80% this year and its bond prices are, trading around 30 cents to the dollar.
Yeah, indeed. The crisis was on full display this week as hundreds of protesters took to the streets to protest the government and Evergrande for not delivering on its housing promises. We had a lot of Chinese citizens who made their payments in full to get their apartments, to get their housing, and Evergrande has yet to start work on the construction of those houses. So it's left hundreds of protesters, hundreds and thousands even, of Chinese citizens wondering if they're going to get the biggest investment of their life.
Saying they spent their entire family's lifetime savings to purchase their properties. But now there seems to be little hope their future houses will ever be finished.
In other Evergrande news, it was reported that Chinese Estates, a major contributor to Evergrande, had sold a bunch of its stock and dumped it onto the market, lowering its overall stake in the company to just over 2%, and at its height, it had 9% exposure to the company. So when you start to see these protesters and you start to see your friends walk away from you, in the case of Evergrande, that's definitely not a good sign for the longevity of the company. And I think we can see this even more when we see that Evergrande had its football field seized and will be auctioned off by the Chinese authorities. And the company will be delisted from the stock market, which is one of Hong Kong's premier stock indices. So, while we didn't see any big debt payments missed this week, we saw a number of developments that shows that the Evergrande crisis is definitely still ongoing, and nothing appears to be getting better. All is not okay, despite those major payments that were made a few weeks ago. Speaking of not okay, we saw more and more signs this week of the Chinese economy getting into real trouble. The producer price index was up 13%, a little over 13%, which was its highest in over 26 years. The producer price index measures all of the inputs that go in when you're producing goods into the factories. And when those prices are up, we can definitely expect that the prices will be passed on to consumers, which will lead to higher inflation. This is obviously not great for the West, as higher inflation in China will be passed on to the goods sold to the West, sold to Canada, sold to the United States, and we are having our own inflation problems right now. More and more warnings started to come out from the People's Bank of China, their Federal Reserve, their Bank of Canada, about stagflation, the potential for stagflation in China. If you'll remember from previous videos, stagflation is when you have low economic growth and high unemployment. The problem with this is that it really limits the amount of options available to fix the situation. If you raise rates to lower inflation, that's going to lower growth. If you lower rates to increase growth, it's going to cause inflation to go sky high. We saw this in the 70s and the 80s, and it led to 15-20% interest rates. It was the only way to fix it, and some people think that we are actually heading that way in the West right now, and that's definitely probably on the table, but we don't often hear signs of stagflation in China. So when the People's Bank comes out and says that stagflation, quasi-stagflation, is going to be a real worry, I mean, that's a concerning sign coming out of the second biggest economy in the world. We had stagflation here in the West in the 70s, as mentioned, but we haven't seen it yet where it's in both parts of the world, where we have it with the biggest producer economy and the biggest consumer economy, both experiencing stagflation. There's really no playbook for that. So that's definitely a concern coming out of the Chinese economy. We've spoken in previous weeks about the Communist Party state encouraging Evergrande's founder to use his own money to shore up Evergrande's finances. But we received reports this week that they have been also encouraging a number of other real estate developers to use their own money in order to shore up those developers' finances. There was a report released by Bloomberg showing that companies are pledging over $3.8 billion of their own funds to shore up the finances to make the payments of these real estate developers. I thought this was really interesting, as we did note a few weeks ago that capitalism works different in China. Here in the West, as shown in the 2008 financial crisis, we would never expect to see Dick Folds or Jamie Dimon put up their own funds to save their companies. They turn to the government to do that. But when we look here in China, we do see the government actually putting the screws, as it were, to the major owners of these real estate developers to help save the companies, to help with the Chinese economy. And I think this was noted by a researcher at Hong Kong University, saying that these moves stand in contrast with counterparts overseas, where the concept of limited liability generally shields owners' personal wealth from creditors' claims. And then this is in stark contrast with China, where regulators can really put the screws onto the owners of these firms to step up to the plate. So it's just very interesting to see how much different capitalism works in China than we see here in the West. And it also makes predicting what's going to happen even more difficult, as we're really only accustomed to our version of capitalism and how our leaders deal with economic crises. So it should be very interesting to see how the leaders continue to put pressure on these real estate developers to make their payments to avoid default. Speaking of other developers, Kaisa, which owes the second most amount of money to offshore bondholders, foreign bondholders from the West. It owes the second most amount of money after Evergrande to those bondholders, and they've been having just as much, if not more, of an issue paying back their debts than Evergrande has. They came out with an interesting proposal this week to their bondholders, saying that they will trade their current bonds, $400 million worth, which are due on December 7th. They will trade those bonds for new bonds, new promises, paying the same amount of money, but that wouldn't be due until June of 2023. So they're basically asking for an extension of about 18 months from these offshore bondholders. But what I thought was really interesting was that's the carrot. We're going to give you new bonds. We're going to pay you eventually. But what I thought was really interesting was the stick. The company noted that if the bondholders refuse this offer, they may have to look for alternative ways to restructure their debt, which I think many took to mean they'll just go bankrupt. So it's either you take this extension and get your $400 million maybe in 18 months, or you don't get it at all. So that kind of reminds me of the saying, if I owe you $50, I have a problem. If I owe you $5 million, you have a problem. Because Kaisa owes so much money to these offshore bondholders, it may seem like the bondholders have the most power, but to a certain extent, Kaisa has quite a bit of power, as the bondholders don't want to take that $400 million hit. The minute that Kaisa does default, misses that payment, that could be considered a default, which triggers a whole bunch of dominoes that can go down. It can trigger cross defaults across industries. Those bondholders could have put up those bonds as collateral for other risks, and that's the big domino effect that we've always been concerned about, that we were so concerned about with Evergrande when it might not have made its payments after those 30-day grace periods. So I thought that Kaisa's offer was really interesting, and the bondholders have until next Thursday to decide if they're going to take it. And I think that'll be a really, really interesting development, and all eyes will be on what happens with the offshore bondholders. So this week we had some major developments out of Evergrande. We saw major protesters against the company and against the government. We saw the government intervening, seizing the football field from Evergrande, and we saw it being a lot of its shares dumped and it being delisted from one of the major stock exchanges in Hong Kong. So obviously things aren't going great for Evergrande. We also saw things aren't going great for the Chinese economy, with major worries of stagflation, and we checked in with the other real estate developers and it's not looking great there either. We do go over this every week because China is the second largest economy in the world. When they sneeze, we will feel it. In much the same manner as when the US had its financial crisis in 2008, the rest of the world felt it as well. So, I do want to keep on tracking these developments from China, and especially this development from Kaisa, who we will find out next Thursday if the bondholders took the bait and whether or not they are going to allow just these extensions. Because, I mean, if Kaisa can get it, then all of the other real estate developers should be able to get it as well, one would think. Are we just looking at kicking the can down the road, or are the bondholders going to stand up to these real estate developers, and what role is Beijing going to play in this? I think these are going to be really interesting developments, and if you want to get them, click like and subscribe to get those updates, and thanks so much for watching.